In this video, I really want to talk about something that I get asked a lot, which is what type of fishing line should I use with X technique, whatever that technique may be. Now, I have actually went through and created what I call the equipment series playlist on this channel, where I go through specific techniques, whether that's a jig, a chatterbait, whatever it may be, a topwater, and I will tell you the rod, reel, and line that I like with that specific technique and why I like it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the best for you. And in this video, that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit, because you will find that when it comes to a certain technique, that there might be a lot of anglers, whether that's your favorite pro fishermen, different YouTubers, that are going to tell you a little bit something different here and there. And really, I just kind of want to explain why it can be different and really how you can kind of look at some overall generalizations about fishing line and fishing rods and be able to come to what works best for you. So in this video, we're going to talk all about that. Now, before we get into the video, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. Today is the last day, Cyber Monday. It is December 2nd. Today is the last day where if you buy something, which everything pretty much on the website is 20% to 30% off, you are going to get a free lure of some sort. I have this huge bin full of a ton of really cool baits, and every single order is going to get a random lure. Also, anyone who orders today is also going to be put into a drawing to win a free ARC Cobb Series rod. This is one of my favorite rods. It's a 6-foot, 10-inch rod that you can use for jigs, Texas rigs, spinner baits, buzz baits. It's a really good, versatile rod. So anyways, I'm not going to ship out anything until tomorrow morning. So as long as you order before then, you will be able to get a lure and be able to have a chance at getting a rod. So I'm going to leave some links down below in the description. Shopping at Fin is surely the best way to help support this channel, and now is a great time to buy. All right, let's talk about fishing line and fishing techniques, and I'm also going to talk a lot about fishing rods in this video, because really when it comes to a technique, the two most important components, besides probably the hooks on a bait, are your line in your rod and how you do things a little bit differently. Now, the biggest thing that I think is really important for every bass fisherman, every angler out there to understand is really kind of the different characteristics that different fishing lines have. Because if you think about the three main fishing lines out there, I mean, you have monofilament, you have fluorocarbon, you have braided line. Those are really the three main ones. You also have copolymers. You have different lines that are, fluorocarbon coated lines. There's a lot of different lines out there, but the three main ones are monofilament, fluorocarbon, and braid. And so it's always very important as an angler to just understand the characteristics that those lines have when it comes to picking out a bait, and also how that is going to change what rod you use. Because like I said, in every single technique that you have to have a little bit of, you have to have the right backbone in the rod to set the hook. You also have to have the right amount of give. And so you kind of have to, depending on what line you decide to throw a bait on, you kind of have to cater your rod to that line, or vice versa. Depending on what rod you want, you might have to cater the line, and you might have to change it up as you go. So let me just explain a little bit here about what I'm talking about. For example, I used to throw my top water baits, treble hooks, top water baits on straight monofilament line. Now with straight monofilament, if I'm making a long cast, typical monofilament is going to have 25% stretch in it. So just think about that. If you make a 50-foot cast, that is going to be 12.5 feet that line could stretch in just a 50-foot cast, okay? So imagine how much stretcher is in that line. So when you set the hook, you're gonna have a tremendous amount of stretch. With that kind of stretch in your line, you don't always have to be super anal about what rod that you go with, because the line is going to take up a lot of give that you need in order to keep that fish pinned, in order to keep that fish hooked. So a lot of times if you use straight mono, you can get away with a medium heavy, even a fast action rod. Now I still wouldn't recommend that, but a lot of times you can get away with it because there is so much stretch in your line. Now, a number of years ago, I went to using pretty much just a straight braid with my top waters. I really prefer that. I feel like you get a longer cast. I feel like you just have a more direct connection with the fish. Now, I do include a very small monofilament or fluorocarbon leader. Usually it's about a foot or a foot and a half. It doesn't really impact the amount of stretch though, because the thing with braid is that there's zero stretch. So if I were to use the exact same top water rod, say it's a medium heavy, fast action rod, with that braid, you're going to rip out a lot of hooks. You're going to lose a lot of fish on your top waters. And that's simply because you changed up the line. And that line has a lot of different characteristics than mono, with the main one being that it has zero stretch to it. So now when you are bringing that fish in, if you have that fast action rod and straight braid and that fish goes up to jump, like, there's not enough give on your rod to help keep that lure kind of in a place where it's not going to have a lot of movement, and it's going to be able to go all over the place, and you're going to lose a lot of fish. You also, because there's no give, if that fish, digs right there at the boat, and maybe you're not thumbing your bait cast reel, or maybe you don't have your drag set, that fish could easily pull those small treble hooks out of its mouth. And so you have to be able to switch up your rods if you're using a different line. So for example, I've gone to, really slow, moderate action rods when I'm using a straight braid because I want to have a lot of give there. That give, that really parabolic bend, helps to keep that fish on. Now, the same thing, it can apply to a lot of different techniques. And so that's why you may hear someone give you a rod, or a certain rod in a line that they like with one particular technique, and then have a different guy tell you something completely different. Another a big thing that I have seen a lot is there are guys out there, for example, like I like to use fluorocarbon with my chatterbait rod, but my chatterbait rod is a lot more parabolic bending rod. And so there's a lot of give there, especially when the bass goes to eat that bait. Because if you think about it, when a chatterbait is coming through the water, and I don't have a chatterbait, I have this chatterbait with me. I should have prepared a little bit better. But if a chatterbait is going through the water, a fish comes up to suck that bait in, there's going to be a little bit of, that bass creates negative pressure in its mouth. When it opens its mouth, it's literally going to draw that chatterbait into its mouth. And that's how a bass eats. When it draws that bait into its mouth, just think of what that's going to feel like though on your end when you're holding a rod. If you're using a straight fluorocarbon line that has a little bit less stretch than monofilament, you're going to feel that thing a lot quicker. So if you're using a fast action rod with fluorocarbon that has, less stretch than mono, you feel it almost too quick. And you will actually set the hook too soon, and therefore that fish may not get that bait as deep. This is something that I literally went through back in the day, because I used to use fluorocarbon. I still use fluorocarbon on my chatterbaits, but I used to use a jig rod with my chatterbait rod, which was a 7-foot 2-inch medium heavy power fast action rod. And I thought, you know what, this looks exactly like a jig. Why shouldn't I use my jig rod? And I realized that I was losing fish from time to time. I also had a ton of fish hooked on the outside, like right on the inside of the lip, like really close to the end of their mouth. Now, as soon as I went to that more moderate bending rod where that fish could inhale that bait a little bit deeper without me feeling it, that allowed me to lose a lot less fish. And so that is just the little things that you have to consider. Now, maybe you have a rod that you really like for chatterbaits. And I know that Todd Otten, who's a professional angler, does this. He has a jig rod that he uses for a chatterbait, but instead of using fluorocarbon, he uses mono. Now the mono is acting as that give, where the mono will stretch a little bit when that fish inhales it, therefore not allowing him to feel that bite quite as quick, and he gets a good hook set. So you can kind of see how, depending on what line that you go with and rod you go with, how these different systems can really, how they can just be so different. The other thing that you have to think about too is the way that you set the hook. Because I believe as an angler that I think your hook set, if the way that you set the hook, the way that you're comfortable with, as long as you're not breaking off fish and as long as you're not losing fish, I don't think that you should always fix your hook set if it's working for you. This, to me, this is a lot like a golf swing. I had a cousin who was like dominant at golf as a high schooler, like super good at golf, literally won like every single tournament. And he lived down in Florida. And when he got to college, the coaches were trying to fix his grip because the grip was not right, even though it worked for him. And honestly, it messed him up. Like, it truly messed him up. And so to me, I've always kind of thought the same thing with the hook set. If you have a particular hook set that works for you, I think that you should kind of keep that hook set. But I think that you should cater your rods and your line to your hook set. For example, I set the hook hard. I know that I set the hook hard. Like, it's just in me. And for the most part, it is fine. Now, every now and then, I will break off a fish. And over the years, I have learned that I can get away with a little bit more moderate bending rods in general because I know that I'm going to get a very hard hook set in that fish. And so I can have a little bit more give in my rod. And so maybe you're out there and you just don't set the hook. Now, let me also be clear on the hook set. I know that I set it too hard. There's going to be a lot of guys that'll be like, well, just stop setting the hook too hard. I get that, but it's just not in me. It's kind of like that golf swing thing. So I like to go with a little bit lighter rods, or I shouldn't say lighter rods, more moderate bending rods at times because it will help me on the hook set. So anyways, I just want to kind of show you guys why this can be so different. Why you will hear one guy say this is what they like for a certain technique, this is what they like for another technique. And I want to leave you with this one thing here because this, I remember hearing Ish Monroe talk about this a number of years ago. Ish Monroe is a professional bass fisherman, and he was talking about another professional bass fisherman named Tommy Biffle. And if you guys know anything about professional bass fishing, Tommy Biffle was one of the best like a number of years ago. And his like forte was flipping and pitching, and specifically, you know, fishing a jig a lot, fishing a Texas rig a lot. Now, back in the day when he did this, back in the day when he was fishing and fishing well, he primarily used monofilament line because fluorocarbon really hadn't become popular. And so when he was using monofilament, he was using a very stiff rod. You know, like it would be known that he's basically using a pool cue stick out there to set the hook. But again, it worked fine because he was using mono. And there's a ton of stretch in the mono, so he can have a stiffer rod. Now, when fluorocarbon came around, Tommy Biffle apparently started losing a lot of fish. But because he switched to monofilament, he kept his same rod. And because of that, he started losing fish. And the reason being is because now he has that really stiff rod. He has fluorocarbon line that doesn't have near as much stretch. And when you have a system that is overpowering the fish, you will rip holes in that fish. And when you rip large holes on the hook set, when that fish comes up and shakes, it can spit the hook really easy. So this is why you just always have to think about your line and your rod and how they are working together. And sometimes, honestly, you have to guess up front. And then you kind of have to catch a few fish. And I always inspect how a fish is hooked. How is it hooked? Is it hooked, you know, just one time through the mouth? Is there a big tear in that fish? That's a good thing to look at. If there's a big tear of that hook on that hook set, that may mean you're like me and you're setting the hook really hard, and you might have to go with a little bit more moderate bending rods to kind of give you some more, or you could step down to mono. So you just have that. That's why you just have so many different thoughts and theories as to what the right, you know, tech or rod and reel or line is for a technique, because everyone is a little bit different. And so that's just what I always look at. Look at how your fish are hooked. All right, guys. Hope I conveyed this in a way that you guys understand. Also, don't forget to check out that fin fishing gear, and I will see you guys tomorrow.